Hello, Gold participants from around the world. I'm Fleur Bickford, Program Director and MC for Gold Learning. I'm here today with Cynthia Mojab, and we are talking about her upcoming alumni presentation titled My Brain is Doing What? Bias, Ethics, and the Lactation Specialist. So welcome, Cynthia. We're happy to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here myself.
Great. So we'll jump straight into a few questions here. Just would love to have you tell us a little bit about yourself and your professional journey in counseling. You've spoken for us a number of times, and we've talked in the past about your lactation background, but given the topic that you're presenting, I'd love to know more about your background in counseling.
Sure. I am a clinical counselor out here in the state of Washington in the U.S. And my primary focus here is on perinatal mental health and also in providing lactation-friendly mental health care so that you don't have to have your lactation experience undermined because you needed to seek mental health services. And I have lots of free resources related to mental health care on my website. And also one thing that is relevant, especially to this presentation, is that I've, from the very beginning when I was in graduate school, been interested in the cultural side of things. My master's thesis was done in 3 cultures and 3 languages, which was a huge project. And I've been living biculturally and bilingually for nearly 30 years. So all of my work, including my counseling, my presentations, are all influenced by that long-standing interest in culture and culture broadly. Not just what country am I from or something, but how does socioeconomic status affect my life, that kind of thing, or gender identity expression, culture as broadly as you can imagine it. So I bring, those interests into my kind of crossover between the breastfeeding world and the counseling world, which is where a presentation like this comes from.
That's fantastic, and I really love that you do have that background and you really bring a unique perspective to your talk, so really looking forward to this one. Just for those of our delegates who are listening, what is your website, the web address, so that people can find it, because I know you have some amazing resources there.
Thank you. Yeah, it's www.lifecirclecc.com.
Okay, perfect. So for our delegates, make sure you check that out because, like I mentioned, Cynthia has some great resources and information there. So, okay, so we're going to talk a little bit now about your topic. And when I was reading your abstract, I was really intrigued by your statement in the abstract that says, avoiding bias is not an act of willpower or the natural result of good character. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. This kind of actually dates back to graduate school. Because of my strong interest in culture and my thesis being related to 3 cultures, I was studying classes that people who are master's students in clinical psychology wouldn't normally study. I was studying, about social psychology, and part of the content in those courses was about, bias and attitudes and how they're all influenced by all kinds of things that we don't even realize. So my interest got piqued back then, and I've been studying about bias and how our brain works ever since. And so there's a lot of things that happen in the human brain that have been very well researched over a very long time that I talk about in this presentation. It's kind of like some shortcuts, some mental shortcuts that our minds naturally take and that have quite a few benefits from their existence. These things come in handy. These mental shortcuts can come in very, very handy. The challenge is that sometimes they trip us up, and it doesn't matter how good a person we are, how much good in the world we do, how wonderful our values are, how good our intentions are. We all have these mental shortcuts that our brains engage in just because we're human. And so this presentation is kind of trying to share some of that information so that we know more about what's going on in our own brains and why yes, us good people, us with good characters, us doing good in the world, why we are still vulnerable to having bias and having that bias negatively impact our work.
Okay, thank you for that. It's really interesting to hear you talk about that, and to think about the fact that even though we think that we're, doing good unintentionally, there may be things that we're, doing that are, where we're kind of showing our biases and stuff like that. So
Exactly. It can sneak right in there, right underneath our radar, and we're not even aware it's happening.
mhm. Fascinating. Okay, so what are some of the things that you hope delegates will take away from your presentation and be able to kind of apply to their work?
Yeah, I guess my main hope is that people will be more aware how vulnerable we are all to bias. That this isn't a failing, a fault, or something. It's just a human vulnerability. I'm right in there with everybody else. I've got biases in my brain too, and I've got to watch for how they're impacting my work. Not if they're impacting my work, but how they're impacting my work. And so I'm hoping that by sharing the information that I've found useful in grappling with my own biases, I'm hoping it will make it easier for other people to become more aware of their own, but also to become more aware of how we can change how we do our work in the world to try to catch those biases, to guard against them, to lessen their effect. We're never going to eliminate them. We can lessen their impact. We can lessen their magnitude. It's pretty, I think, impossible to completely eliminate bias in our minds, but when we're aware that it's there, then we can change how we do what we do to purposefully go looking, for the impact and lessen the impact.
Okay, thank you for that. As I'm listening to you talk, one thing that kind of strikes me is thinking about the fact that often when we hear the word bias, it's it's always perceived as a bad thing. Being biased is a bad thing, and but in hearing you talk about the fact that it's an inherent vulnerability, and I love that word that you used for it of us as human beings. It makes me think of the fact that, I frequently talk to my kids about feelings and the fact that feelings aren't good or bad. It's what we do with them that matters. So would you say the same is true for bias?
Well, sure. I mean, one way of looking at bias, just as at the highest level, is that it's just a tendency to, think in a certain direction, right? Well, maybe one of your tendencies is to think that, I don't know, pick a genre of music is wonderful. Well, you may not do much harm with that. You may just be enjoying music in your life and you have a bias towards that particular genre of music that you love. If you're going to be in a car, that's the radio station you're going to want to find. If you go to a store, you want to go buy that kind of music. And, that's just kind of a personal preference that you have that is a bias that doesn't really hold any harm to it. It's just your personal preference. What happens with bias is when we start imposing those biases on other people. If we only let people around us listen to the genre of music that we like, we don't, support anybody else's, liking of it, then we can run into harm. And so that's kind of where bias can change from something that could be neutral or positive into something that's negative. And of course, there certainly could be biases that already begin in a negative way, that can only be applied in a negative way. But yet bias in general is simply, that tendency towards some kind of thinking about something. That's where our minds are going, consciously or unconsciously. It could be positive, could be neutral, could be negative. But even a positive bias could be hurtful if we try to impose it on everyone else, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does, absolutely. And, I think that's a great way of looking at it as, needing to avoid imposing our biases on other people. And I love the music analogy as well. That was great to illustrate your point. So thank you so much for that. For our delegates who are listening, I have had the pleasure and privilege of having a sneak peek at Cynthia's PowerPoint for this presentation, and it's fascinating with lots of information about what is actually going on in our brains and why these biases exist and how they develop and stuff like that. So definitely a presentation to not miss. And you can hear more from Cynthia on January 25th at 1800 UTC. And that will be during our alumni presentations, and you can find out more at the Gold Learning website at www.goldlearning.com. Thank you so much, and we will see you soon.